next interview is with Tom Woods. Now, Tom is a smart guy, Harvard undergrad, PhD from Columbia University in history. Now, why is that relevant here? Because we should be looking at historical context to understand what's going on in the world right now. Tom is the host of the Tom Woods Show. He's a very gifted communicator, and I believe he has a very sharp and interesting context when it comes to this whole COVID scenario. So I really enjoyed my time with him, and I think you will too. Tom, I've been looking forward to this conversation. Thanks for taking the time.
Always like talking to you, Patrick. Thank you.
So let's get back into your background a little bit. It's interesting that you speak about this subject, and we'll understand why in a few moments. But let's get first back into let's start with your academic background. What'd you study in school? Where'd you go, and all that kind of stuff?
Well, I went to Harvard and Columbia. Harvard for undergraduate, Columbia University for my PhD. All of this was in history, so I'm looking forward to being a historian of what we've been living through and chronicling it. And as a matter of fact, and this isn't quite to your question, but I'll get to that in a minute, it occurred to me that whatever textbook chapter appears in a typical school textbook of American history dealing with COVID is going to be filled with nothing but propaganda and nonsense. You know that as well as I do. Yeah. There's no question about that. So one of my projects for the future, it has to wait until COVID winds down a little bit more because there's still so much to say and experience, unfortunately. But I want to write and give it away for free to the world. I want to write the chapter of your kid's textbook that they should read instead. They should forget about the COVID chapter that they're being given. And I'll have it. I haven't put anything up there yet, but I bought the domain pandemicchapter.com. I'm going to write this. It's going to have charts and graphs and pictures, and it's going to look like a textbook chapter. The difference being it's not propaganda, and give it to the world for free for parents, teachers, anybody in the world to use. That'll be my project. So anyway, so I have this elite Ivy League background, but it in a way prepared me for today because although of course I learned an enormous amount in my traditional schooling, at the same time, there was an awful lot that was left out or that was distorted or whatever that I had to find out for myself. And I had the benefit as an undergraduate of having access to the largest private library in the world. And the books I wanted to check out, I never had to worry anybody else was checking them out. They were always right there collecting dust on the shelves. So I was able to supplement my formal education with the activities of an autodidact. I really did have to learn a lot of the stuff that I would later teach on my own. And the parallel with today, I think should be obvious that if I had a steady diet of CNN, I would know absolutely nothing about what was going on in the world. I might know some facts, like this man's name is Anthony Fauci. I would learn those facts, it's true. But everything else I would have to supplement with other sources. So I've been doing this my whole life at this point.
Wow. Well, it's kind of fascinating. And this is one of the reasons I was really excited to talk to you is because, we can certainly talk about the science. We've had multiple people, that have come on who are scientists and academics and researchers in medicine and getting their insights around COVID and what's going on. And that's been quite fascinating. But there's this larger picture that I think is actually the more critical aspect, and that is the assault on liberties. The assault on the Constitution. And when I say assault, I don't think anybody denies that no matter what your orientation might be, that there's a tyrannical approach towards how to enforce society in the context of what is perceived as an emergency. So some people applaud it, saying, yes, misinformation should be taken down, First Amendment should be basically put aside while we're in the middle of this emergency. Of course, I don't agree with them. But in my mind, there's ominous parallels between what's going on now and historically what's happened at very dark times in human history. And I figured you probably have been observing these better than anybody. So I'd love for you to talk about how you see things right now.
Well, I had the good fortune on my podcast, The Tom Woods Show, of speaking to somebody who serves in the Australian government at the level of Victoria, and that's where they've had some of the harshest lockdowns. That's where Melbourne is, and people, and this is as of late summer, early fall, we're still and for all I know, still going on, being told that they could, and by the way, this is a liberalization of the law. They could have 3 hours out of their homes, 3 whole hours, but they can't be anywhere farther away than 5 kilometers from their homes. That it has been the most irrational, anti-science, insane monomania you can imagine. And the police will come, will beat you if you leave your house and it's unauthorized. For a while, they had playgrounds closed. Now, we had playgrounds closed in the US too because of hysteria. They were reopened again fairly soon compared to Australia, where it took forever for them to reopen. And then it was, well, but only one parent can be there at a time. Or parents can be there, but you can't remove your mask to take a sip of coffee while I mean, and none of this is going to do any good. There's no scientist who think that's going to do any good. But at the same time, there are people, I believe, in the American public health establishment who would have liked nothing more than to see a regime like this put in place. And then, there were a couple of Israeli politicians caught on a hot mic in which they admitted that particular measures they had taken with their Green Pass were not founded in science, but just to humiliate the unvaccinated and ruin their lives to the point where they would just surrender. So it is, as I suspected, punitive. And in terms of the Constitution, well, this goes to show why it is every single time there is an opening on the Supreme Court, the nominee gets the same constitutional questions. They always want to know, what do you think about the Commerce Clause? That's the first thing. And then maybe they'll ask about a couple of other clauses. But the Commerce Clause has been the hole they've driven a truck through, whereby a limited government with only enumerated powers gets transformed into an unlimited government, because they claim that, well, if something affects interstate commerce, then sorry, I guess the federal government can do whatever it wants with it. The famous case, maybe some viewers will know, is from 1942, Wickard versus Filburn, which said that a farmer growing wheat on his own property to consume either himself or for his livestock to consume is actually, even though he's growing it here, consuming it here, he's engaged in interstate commerce implicitly, because by abstaining from buying the wheat from interstate commerce, he has thereby affected interstate commerce. So obviously this means anything affects interstate commerce. Breathing, existing, anything affects interstate commerce. And that's just the way they like it. Obviously, there would not have been any point in listing the federal government's powers in the Constitution if they then added a clause that said, oh, by the way, pretty much anything that you might find convenient or useful can also be done. The Commerce Clause was intended to, quote, regulate interstate commerce in the 18th century sense of regulate, that is, to make regular, to remove obstacles to the free flow of commerce, so that the individual states would not be imposing tariffs on each other. Those would be struck down by the Interstate Commerce Clause. But now it's just taken on this crazy life of its own. And are we reaping well, not benefits, whatever the opposite is.
Yeah, the detriments.
Yeah.
So, it's interesting when you talk about interstate commerce, and we just had a thing happen recently with the White House using OSHA, and Ted Cruz, I think, said, intent matters in the law. So the intent of the law was what you said, is to make sure that there's not interference with the commerce between the states. But other than that, the autonomy of the states was something that was pretty important. And now, they use, and I think the same thing's true with the FDA. If you're not doing something that's under FDA jurisdiction across state lines, then they have no jurisdiction. It's only when there's interstate commerce that they get to come and enforce. Now we've seen this whole thing around emergency powers, right? Emergency use authorizations, that are being given, and then how these powers are invested in people, and they're taking away civil liberties in a startling way. One of which I think is, and this is maybe not enforcement as much as it's something that is being celebrated, is social media platforms, free speech, having open debate, these types of things, and propaganda. So, and I see a lot of this coming out as propaganda, saying that it seems that people are putting out headlines with an agenda, knowing they're not true, but trying to say that the ends justifies the means if we do this. So I guess my question for you is, do you agree that these types of things are going on, at least what I just said? If so, maybe embellish a little. And then number two, where has this happened in history before, and what should we be learning from it?
Well, I actually think that, not to say that there are no parallels to today, but that this will be an episode people will be comparing future episodes to. They'll say, well, we need to learn from that 2020 coronavirus fiasco, the lessons of history. I'm afraid we're providing the lessons of history to people right now. In terms of your first part, what's been astonishing and interesting to me is to observe on, let's say, a platform like Twitter, people being banned from Twitter for saying things that 6 months later everybody admits is true. So, oh, wait a minute, these cloth masks don't seem to do anything. Well, how about that?
Yeah.
I mean, how many people had their, their lives severely disrupted, their livelihoods that depend on communication through social media, all that upended because they said something that it took what we laughingly call our public health establishment a year finally to catch up on and realize was correct. Or when it came to the subject of robust natural immunity, well, this is like a crucifix in front of Dracula to the public health establishment in the U.S., which is so strange, by the way, because in European affairs, we've seen a much more readiness to acknowledge prior infection. If you look at the various restrictions they've put in place, like at a venue or something, they'll say, all right, you need to have either vaccination or a negative test or evidence of prior infection. And this has been true across Europe. This has been true. You can see this from the UK all the way to Russia. The outlier here has been the US. And it makes people wonder, is there something the US knows that the rest of the world doesn't? Now, by the way, sometimes that is true. Maybe that is true sometimes. Highly unlikely here. So it's had people speculating, maybe there are venal motives at work. Maybe there's a financial motive here. There's no money to be made in natural immunity, but there is money to be made in other things. And you talk like this, and some people just shut off. They just can't imagine that anyone could be thinking in monetary terms. But these are people who 99% of the time tell us how evil and profit-seeking and selfish businesses are. But then in this particular one case, they're all impartial angels who are seeking exclusively the common good. Well, I guess that's not totally impossible. But honestly, I think there really are we're really living in a unique situation because we live in a world that has the internet now. And it's interesting to think, I think the internet has been a double-edged sword in this crisis. And I think, as I say, future episodes will look back and say, let's learn the lessons of 2020. It's been a double-edged sword because on the one hand, even with all the insane censorship and the disruption of the free flow of ideas, we still have been able to spread a lot of important information to the more than we would have if there had been only 3 television channels. There's no doubt about that. But at the same time, the governments of the world have also been able to spread insane hysteria all around the world very quickly. And they have all the respectable people associated with them. Why are they respectable people? Because the government chooses them as their spokesman. No other qualification. It's that there are people with every bit as much of a background as Dr. Fauci and all these other self-important people, but because they don't support the regime's approach, well, we just dismiss them. And so it's been hard to get the word out. And secondly, I think in a way, maybe, Patrick, we've learned something about human nature here, that for a long time, perhaps even ongoing, there was a huge swath of certainly the American population that simply did not want to hear any good news. Oh, good, the virus isn't as infectious as we thought. Oh, good, the numbers aren't as devastating as we feared. Or, hey, it turns out that being outdoors at the beach isn't a danger to you after all. I mean, all these sort of things, say, oh, isn't this a relief? Or it really isn't a threat to children. Like there have basically been virtually 0 child deaths from COVID who did not have some extreme comorbidity already threatening their lives. This should be great news. Instead, we still are our news cycle is driven by anecdotal evidence of one person. And then in paragraph 20, you find out the person had 12 things wrong with him. But they're trying to extrapolate from that one person with 12 things wrong with them to you, the life of a completely healthy person with nothing wrong with them. You should be just as afraid as that person. That's been the astonishing thing. But people don't want the good news. They want the hysteria. There are people who want the disruption. I've been flabbergasted at this.
Do you characterize such things as propaganda, or do you think propaganda is something else?
No, I think it is. I think it is propaganda. I mean, when it is, it's manipulation of the public mind for political ends. Now, I don't know if that's technically the definition of propaganda, but I'm using that as a working definition.
Yeah.
And certainly we've seen that. And to see them change their minds, but then act as if they haven't, or claim that the science changed. Where did the science change? Initially, we have Dr. Fauci explaining the problems with masks, and he explains them very succinctly and effectively. And then people say, well, gee, you used to say that masks were useless. By the way, you look at the charts all over the world, it's obvious masks are useless. They introduce masks, nothing happens.
Right.
You can't tell the difference. And he'll say, well, the science changed. Well, what part of the science changed? Show me exactly. Give me the paper that shows me where the science changed. I don't see that. And then the laughable so-called studies. I mean, come on, what, they're mannequin studies, or they're studies where they assume masks work and then they run the study. But that's the very thing that we're trying to prove here. Or they have some Bangladesh study or this and that actually shows that the cloth masks don't work, that maybe the medical masks work a little, but the problem is the confidence interval in the study ranges from 0 to 20%. So the study could be saying that medical masks are 20% effective, or they could be saying that they're 0. And that's really the best that they've come up with. Meanwhile, we have all this real world evidence that seems to show, I mean, we have countries all over the world that are 95, 98% compliant with masks, and cases are going up 1,000%. There's no interest in that. And instead you're propagandized into kind of thinking of the mask as evidence that you're a good rule follower, that you're a good obeyer. And so you get people who will even almost admit that I wear my mask to show that I didn't vote for Trump, or I wear my mask to show that I care about other people's lives. And you say, yeah, but it doesn't do anything. It's clearly obvious it doesn't do anything. And the ridiculous mask you're wearing obviously doesn't do it. I'll never forget Alyssa Milano, the actress.
Yeah.
I will never forget. She, early on, maybe a month into this, she took a picture of herself, posted it on Twitter saying, I've got my mask on. And she wasn't joking. It was a knit mask with holes this big. I mean, it wouldn't hold in like pieces of food spitting from her mouth, much less a virus, right? She's wearing this knit mask. And so it's like it's been an insane propaganda campaign to get people to do things regardless of whether they're evidence-based or not. So I came up with the idea that the real driving force, the real principle, if we can call it that, behind the various measures we've seen is simply this, that if there's something that brings people joy, we should probably ban that just to be safe. But on the other hand, if there's something that makes people miserable or is an extreme inconvenience, it would be better to instead support that. Regardless of whether it works or anything, we feel like if there's pain, if there's sufficient pain, then the labor theory of value kicks into high gear. We must be doing something. We must be accomplishing something if we're inflicting pain on ourselves and on our neighbors.
I think that's actually something that's really interesting. Because you've heard varying forms of statism, communism, socialism, fascism, et cetera, describe the shared misery, right? So if we're sharing this pain, somehow that's virtue, and it's a pretty sadistic, point of view, a pretty sadistic philosophy, but it does seem to be the case, when we see that people don't like the fact that, oh, wait a minute, I'm suffering and I'm doing my part, but you're not suffering and not doing your part. And then we get this segregation between, the vaccinated and the unvaccinated, and the characterization that the unvaccinated are, these, mindless idiots that are ruining it for everybody else. But all the data shows that the highest population of unvaccinated people are PhDs, people like you,
Yeah.
that actually are the most informed, most educated. They're the ones who are looking at this saying this is either insane or at least it's unproven and the safety's not been really demonstrated yet, and I'm not doing this. So it's really, to me, this has become political, right? You
Yeah.
can see regulatory dispositions based on what kind of a state you live in, right? If you live in California, it's one thing. You live in Florida, it's another thing, and everything in between. So, people keep prattling about science, 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 but now it seems like there's been sort of, and this is the thing that's inconceivable for me as a historian, tell me if I'm right or wrong, but it used to be the Democrats were the people who were most focused on civil liberties, at least some decades ago. And now they're the ones that seem to be the most aggressive about taking away civil liberties. What's your observation around that?
Well, unfortunately, I think this is, I don't want to make this political. Honestly, I want to have allies from all backgrounds. I don't want it to be a left-right thing. And unfortunately, that's the way it's panned out. And it's interesting that early in 2020, it was flipped. It was the right wing that was concerned and thinking about banning travel and all this. And it was the left wing saying, oh, you're overreacting. Come on, it's a virus, big deal. And then when Trump, the whole thing just suddenly became reversed. It's totally crazy. I think, frankly, that there are people on the left specifically who are all for civil liberties when it comes to defending themselves.
Mm-hmm.
But that's not because of a principled stance on civil liberties. It's not because they believe in, I think we're learning that they believe in free speech for its own sake. It's, I want it for me, so don't you dare disrupt my ability to speak. But once they feel like they're sufficiently entrenched, well, then we see that, well, that was really just for me. That was a path to power. And now that we're in power, it doesn't really matter for you. And so that's what I think. Now, how much farther do we need to go than just to look at the American Civil Liberties Union? They have civil liberties in the name.
Mm-hmm.
And they've come out. It took them forever to say anything about vaccine passports. It took them forever. I used to taunt them on Twitter. And I would say, hey, ACLU, one of your staffers must have accidentally deleted all your tweets about the dangers of vaccine passports because I can't see a word about them on your feed. Of course, there wasn't a word about them. Oh, they're all up in arms about this or that trivial thing. But the issue of our time, silence. And then finally they said, actually, vaccine passports enhance civil liberties. What?
I almost fell out of my chair. And incidentally, just for the record, I don't identify, Republican, Democrat. I'm a libertarian, as far as my own political philosophy.
Yeah.
But so it's not like I just, prior to all this, I advocated, one or the other. I saw that statement you're talking about, and it literally was the greatest doublespeak I think I've ever seen. It just was such a contradiction. It was mind-boggling to me.
Yeah. And meanwhile, the messaging on the vaccines has gotten to be so crazy. So in effect, what they're now saying is these vaccines are so effective that there's only one small, tiny, trivial thing you need to do after you get them to stay protected. You just have to banish everybody else from society. That's all we have to do, and then your vaccine will be effective. Gee, that's bound to make people thrilled about vaccines. And by the way, meanwhile, this is sometimes propaganda is not just what they say, it's what they leave out. I would venture to guess that almost no American, or let's say 10% maybe, are aware that Denmark around September dropped all their restrictions, every single one. They still had a few countries you couldn't come in from to visit, the US being one of them. I was hoping to go see what life was like in Denmark, but I have a lot of email subscribers to my newsletter who write to me from all over the world, and I have a lot of them in Denmark saying it's genuinely true. We really are back to normal. They did temporarily have one of those virus passes where you had to show your status and various sorts of things, but they actually got rid of that. So first of all, this is a nice, what we call, you've heard of red pills and blue pills. This is a white pill. It's right. A pill that should make you feel not hopeless, that there's nothing set in stone that life has to be like this forever. But at the same time, my friends in Denmark say, because we did lockdown, we still have that hammer hanging over our heads that in case the numbers should get bad, you never know, they might do it again. In Sweden, there seems to be much less likelihood they'll do it again because they didn't do it the first time.
Right.
And again, for several months running, basically zero deaths in Sweden from the virus, zero. They're 100% back to normal. I mean, they have basically the mask compliance is around 1 to 2%. It's like nothing. You go there and you see no evidence of any kind of pandemic going on. In Stockholm, which was the worst hit part of Sweden, and for a while was the worst hit part of Europe, it's like there's nothing going on there. And meanwhile, all these other countries are saying, well, we have to do X, we have to do Y. But the question should be, do you have to? Are you sure that we would have had the same result either way? I mean, when you look at these couple of countries, Denmark, it's true, did have some restrictions early on, but they were fairly laissez-faire, actually, compared to a lot of other countries. Maybe we're doing this for no reason. Why don't we look at these cases of Sweden and Denmark? And you bring this up to them, and it's like their heads explode. They don't know what to do. It's like the stake through the heart of Dracula.
Well, the data is hard to refute because, to your point early on, I was always looking at Sweden because Sweden said, everybody's crazy. What are you talking about? This thing needs to pass through. You only quarantine the vulnerable, the elderly and comorbidity people, and everybody else should stay to work. Otherwise, you create evolutionary pressure on the virus. It's going to mutate. It's you have to allow this to pass through. We saw SARS-CoV-1. We saw MERS. I mean, so it's not like we don't have some precedent for it. But to your point, here's the thing. If the agenda can be vaccinate everyone and you get 100% vaccination rate, you have no controls. So they can say whatever they want, right? So now, but you have these now countries like Sweden, and in the United States, we got 50 different little countries in a sense. So we have controls and reference points to your point as you're making earlier, saying, well, what happens if you didn't do all these things that you said were necessary? Let's look at the data. And the data is looking like, there's stark irrationality built into, the shutdowns, the destroying of people's lives, the vaccine rates, and the forced vaccination. There's a lot of disturbing data coming out of Israel now, who's kind of like before everybody else. And, that narrative, and now imagine that you're in political office, and this is where it gets to be difficult, right? Where you got out in front of people. You mentioned already Fauci, the contradictions and the things that he has said over time and others. Now they're in a predicament that there is data that is showing that the things they said were necessary and essential to protect human beings were not, and actually probably had the opposite effect. They have to find ways to try to, I guess, run for cover or to make everybody else wrong.
Absolutely. I mean, I think, well, first of all, I wanted to, before I forget, mention that Sweden, sometimes they'll say, well, those countries must have been really highly vaccinated. Well, I mean, they have reasonable numbers, but Sweden is number 13 in Europe. So not exactly the top of the pack in terms of vaccination. And they're seeing this result. It's interesting to look at the result of the Palestinians, where they're seeing almost no COVID activity. And how vaccinated do you think they are? So again, we just need answers to these questions instead of pretending that the questions aren't there. But you're absolutely right about how hysterical they are about preventing a control group. Now it's the vaccines. Before it was the lockdowns. Mm-hmm. When Sweden refused to lock down, the hysteria we saw in the international press, I don't think can be attributed to they were just deeply concerned for the well-being of Swedes. Mm-hmm. It was these people have got to lock down because there is always a chance that what we're doing is just going to be a catastrophe. Mm-hmm. And we cannot allow people to say, well, why didn't we do it the way Sweden did? So the fact that they withstood the pressure of the whole world, little Sweden, is extremely impressive, just as impressive as it is that Governor DeSantis in Florida withstood the pressure of everybody. He is ridiculed and smeared and misrepresented. Stephen King, the author, back in September, put out a tweet saying, do you realize 1,200 people died of the virus in Florida, of COVID in Florida today or yesterday alone? Now, Florida has never come anywhere. There weren't that many deaths in all of the United States on that day. from COVID. So he doesn't know how to read the number. I mean, it's
Right.
just embarrassing. 80,000 people liked that. So there are people in America who actually think Florida's doing badly. Now they did have a spike, that's true. But when you look at the overall numbers over the course of the 18, 19, 20 months, well, what do they say? Well, the only number that matters is age-adjusted COVID mortality, because you have to compare apples with apples.
That's right.
Some states have much older people than other states. Florida has, obviously a notoriously old population. People go there to retire explicitly. California has only the 44th oldest population. So you can't just directly compare them. So when you compare them age adjusted, Florida, out of 50 states, you would think Florida must be number one, the death destination of America, right? It must be number one. It's number 40.
Wow.
And these people on social media are calling him Death Santis. He's 40 out of 50.
Yeah.
What kind of an automaton are you?
And this is the disturbing thing. There's confirmation bias is driving the machine all the way now. It's we'll look for every bit of data we can that to confirm a point of view, and I think everybody to some degree is guilty of it. But there's got to be some pardon the pun, injection of rationality here, saying we should want to know the truth. We should not we shouldn't want to spin data to fit a narrative. We should actually see if we can look at raw data, extrapolate information from it, and then have knowledge that is meaningful. And I don't know that we can never get that at this point. There's just too much investment in a certain narrative that prevents us from taking a scientific approach.
Honestly, I feel like we're living in two realities at this point. I don't know how this is ever put back together. Increasingly, I think the Enlightenment was wrong about reason, and I can't believe I'm saying this, but the idea that the characteristic feature of human beings is reason. Now, clearly, compared to a seal or a fish, that is the distinguishing feature, but that doesn't necessarily mean that reason is the faculty we go to in all circumstances. Reason may be the faculty we use to figure out, and now I'm sounding like David Hume, but it may be the faculty we use to figure out if I'm hungry, if A, then B, I need to go eat a sandwich. Reason will do that. But in terms of issues like this, it's like fear and irrationality are such difficult obstacles to overcome. And I do see some people in the public health establishment saying it's going to take forever to regain people's confidence, in given what a fiasco this has been. I think one thing we have learned in this crisis is that so-called, quote, public health seems to attract hypochondriacs and control freaks and insane lunatics, honestly.
Yes.
Well, and I think, to your point, I would make a distinction philosophically between reason and rationality. So
maybe so.
Yeah. So I think that we're reasoning. We're using our ability to reason, but we're not being rational in the way we're applying it. And I think that because you're exactly right. It's saying we have this ability to actually abstractly conceptualize things and think about them and assess them. But we're not being rational in our use of it, and that's leading us into this sort of crazy, crazy world that we're in right now. I mean, it literally is a world gone mad. And I mean, going back to what you were saying earlier, Australia. You had somebody on your show from in Melbourne or Victoria, but looking at what's happening in Sydney, marching kids into stadiums and whatnot. I mean, and at what point does a rebellion occur? And I think maybe a rebellion is occurring. I'm wondering, because this is also, I think, a historian. I think you're like one of the most important people, or historians are really some of the most important people right now to be able to give us context for our irrationality, saying there's historical, in history, humans have whipped themselves up into frenzies, fear has taken over, and this was the outcome in the world, and we might want to all take a step back and take a deep breath if we can learn something from history. I do think we're sort of in an unprecedented episode here, to your point earlier, true, and we're living in a world that is connected via the internet, and has far-reaching implications also. But at the same time, I think the fundamentals of irrational behavior, tyrannical approaches towards trying to deal with what's perceived as a crisis, and what happens in the world when that occurs is something that we could be in very serious trouble here. I mean, where do you think this is all going?
Well, I like to be optimistic by nature. I'm short run pessimistic, but I'd like to think that this will come out all right in terms of people being able to live decent lives. And so in Moscow, they introduced in June of 2021 a kind of vaccine passport system for restaurants and things like that. And you had to show either the proof of vaccination, the negative test, or the proof of prior infection. And within a month, that was overturned. The restaurateurs were screaming about what it was doing to business, and eventually it got overturned. So the question will be, is the political system as responsive in the United States as it is in Moscow? It's a legitimate question, right? And the other thing that I guess concerns me about the future is we have to put, now everybody supports science. There's nobody, this whole thing, you're anti-science. I don't think there's really anybody who's anti-science, right? That is just a dumb guy term, a low IQ term meant to demonize certain people. Nobody's anti-science. What we are against is the worship of scientists. Science, the process, who could be against that? But what we've seen, and moreover, the extension of quote unquote science into areas where it clearly doesn't belong. So if Dr. Fauci says the most urgent thing for us to do is X, well, that's because his goal is B or something. But who says that he gets to tell us what our goals are or what our priorities are? I have no doubt that Fauci would love to live in a world where if there was just one case, he could shut down the country. I'm sure he would love that. But science can't tell us whether that is something we should do. They can say, if you want to accomplish this, then you should do that. But it can't tell us, well, maybe we don't want to accomplish that because maybe it comes at too high of a cost. Look at the cost the people of Australia are bearing. Those kids have not had normal lives. They've been stuck literally in their physical homes, not able to see anybody for a year and a half, going on 2 years. There's no way that price is worth it. But science, you can't put a proposition like that in a test tube and get a scientific answer telling you, nope, it is worth it. It's a philosophical question whether something is worth it. But as soon as you try to have these philosophical discussions, people act as if science has already decided them. How could a test tube decide the meaning of your life and what the priorities you have are? Or furthermore, there's no class, Dr. Fauci, and I use him as a representative of all the crazy lunatics. There's no class he took when he was in college teaching him, well, if you shut down all of society, you're going to have to balance that against supply chain disruptions and other health problems and mental health and domestic violence and whatever. There's no class for that. He's just going by the seat of his pants. He doesn't know. So, but the idea that, well, he's a scientist, so he hasn't even thought it through. I think it was September, October, somebody finally asked him, are you considering the side effects, the collateral damage of these lockdowns? And he admitted that he wasn't. So how can you, but yet people feel like, well, you can't question the science, but the science can't possibly answer these questions because they're not scientific questions, a lot of them, or they're questions that go into other fields. Maybe they go into economics, maybe they go into a variety of interdisciplinary areas. These are questions that you, according to your own values, only you can answer. Dr. Fauci can't answer them for you.
Well, and this is, I think, important to understand. Things like engineering and so on can be exact sciences. 2 + 2 = 4 every single time. The clinical sciences, the biological sciences, they're not exact science. And that's the thing that you said it, and this is 100% right. It's an ignorant statement to say, well, we follow the science and you don't follow the science, or we believe in science and these people who aren't getting the vaccine don't believe in science. That's absurd, and it's literally the person who makes such a proclamation is displaying an extraordinary ignorance toward understanding. This is complex. It's not just one very linear, simple thing. You're aligned with science if you get vaccinated, and you're not if you don't. That's a stupid thing to say. There's a lot of complexity in understanding virology, vaccinology, epidemiology. These things are deep and complicated sciences that you have to have some context to be able to draw conclusions. And to your point, the question is, what is the end in mind here? You see, because as you said, Fauci maybe agrees or has admitted, I'm not giving consideration to the collateral damage. So that's a very narrow saying. I have one job. My job is to try to do the best I can to impede the spread of this virus and people who might be injured from it. And I'll do that at all costs. Meaning, hey, if I save, even if this were true, if I save 10,000 lives, in my actions from the virus, but I cost 100,000 lives as far as collateral damage, well, that's not my problem. My problem was to lower the death rate from the virus, even if it increases death rates in other in other dimensions. And to your point, as we've seen, are the skyrocketing suicide ideation, depression, domestic abuse. You can go down the line. You can see the cost to society for the actions has been quite extraordinary.
Also, don't forget the propaganda campaign about you're selfish. You're selfish because you want to live a life worthy of a human being and you don't want to live like a vegetable. That makes you selfish. But it always seemed to me that the selfishness was exactly the other way, that it's not my job. I mean, I'm just about to turn 50. Or I'll put it this way. It's my job to look after younger people, like my children. It's not their job to look after me when they're 15 years old. That's not their job. Maybe when they're 40 and I'm 107 or something, they're going to have to maybe help me out. But when they're kids, that's not their job. My job is to protect them and give them a good life and say to them, when I was a kid, I got to have all these wonderful and irreplaceable experiences. And I want you to have those experiences too. But instead, the messaging seems to be, well, when I was a kid, I got to do all these things. But sorry, kid, you got to stay home. You can't experience all those joys. You have to stay home and wonder what the point of your life is. Why isn't that selfish? Couldn't I just as easily frame it that way? Why isn't that selfish? It doesn't serve the regime. It doesn't serve the propaganda campaign. So we hear nothing about it. And to me, by the way, it's amazing how much resistance we have. I mean, of course, I want much more resistance. I want to see entire societies rising up. And I've been very disappointed about that. But considering what we are up against, almost every Hollywood actor, almost every musician, and if there's a handful of musicians who speak out against it, the hysteric totalitarians want to cancel them because they can't tolerate even a few dissenting voices. The corporate CEOs pretend to be in favor. I'm sure this is crushing at least some of them, but they feel like they have to pretend. The political class, overwhelmingly, the university professors. Imagine that we still have people willing to stand up, even though there are not as many people as we wish, to stand up against that kind of overwhelming opposition. Under Donald Trump, we had a lot of people saying, we're going to resist. Okay, well, look, I'm against all politicians, so feel free, knock yourself out and resist. But your resistance is being carried out alongside what? All the people I said. I mean, you're with all the university professors and the CEOs and the politicos and the Hollywood people. Well, gee, that must be a breeze to resist that. Try walking in our shoes for 10 minutes, you so-called resistors. See what real resistance is like, getting your name dragged through the mud and being smeared and misrepresented. And then now, if you're unvaccinated, basically being pushed to the edges of society and yet still refusing to go along with the narrative. That's resistance. That takes courage.
Yeah, I agree. And I think there is a silent resistance that's much bigger than the media will ever let you know. And it's portrayed in numbers, though, when you say that, I think we're not much north of 50%. After all the propaganda, all the drive, we're not much north of 50% on that have had two,
Right.
the second shot. And, so with all of the effort that we're sitting where we are as far as, what percentage of the people have gotten the shot, I think they've underestimated the resistance. Because of course the elitists all, oh, these are just dumb people. They'll do whatever we say. Inject a little fear. Give them the savior story, and then turn them loose. Well, they're a lot smarter and shrewder than people might give credit for. We're seeing, like in France, huge demonstrations and hundreds of thousands of people taken to the streets, not covered really in the media. I don't know if you saw a weekend or two ago, but there was a mall outside of Paris that required vaccines to get in, and a mob of unvaccinated people took over the whole mall, in protest of this.
So I mean, these things do encourage me. But then there's also maybe quiet, more modest acts of rebellion that don't make the news. Like, for example, back in late August, I was in Reno, Nevada. I was there for a concert, and I was at the Reno Event Center that has a capacity of about 7,000. And at that time, the governor of Nevada had reintroduced a mask mandate after having removed it a couple of months earlier. He put it back in. And so all through the state, any indoor venue, you have to have the mask. So everybody walking into the building was wearing the mask, and out by the concessions, they were wearing the mask, and buying T-shirts, they were wearing the mask. And then they went inside the venue itself. I am not joking, Pat. It was 95%. There were no masks. There was no security person who was going to go up to 19 out of 20 people and say, put your mask on. They were gone. And Nevada has a Democratic governor. It's not by any means it's maybe a purple state, we might say. It's not a red state by any means, but everybody knew. But the funny thing is, these are people, I would guess 3/4 of these people the very next day would be talking about the importance of wearing your mask. So it goes to show that in their heart of hearts, they kind of know that I take the mask off and nothing seems to happen.
Yeah. Well, look at college football, I mean, so we see so many contradictions, and I believe there's going to be a tidal wave of inescapable data coming from events such as you're talking about. Well, look at Obama's birthday party, right? Out in Martha's Vineyard. I mean, there's so many contradictions. Gavin Newsom, enforcing all these things and eating at the French Laundry with a group and nobody's wearing a mask. I mean, these people don't believe what they're saying. They believe in power and control, and they want to step up and enforce that control, but the rules don't apply to them. And there's only a certain level that I think the masses will have tolerance for that. So, I'm an optimist too, and I'm chilled by what I'm seeing, but simultaneously, I do believe in the power of the people, and over time that's going to prevail. At least I'm really hoping so.
Well, the thing we need to allow is for people who really had their lives ruined by the lockdowns. There are people who are financially ruined. If you were in the entertainment industry or adjacent to the entertainment industry, maybe you do audio services, or maybe you own a venue or whatever, anything like that, ruined. I mean, you were ruined. Yeah. I've seen venues close in my area because what am I supposed to do? And we could go down the list of people who were ruined. Some people came out ahead, but a lot of people were ruined. But you can't tell the story. Because if you tell your story, then you're a selfish bastard. But I want to hear those stories, because those stories matter. Those people matter.
It not only matters, it matters significantly, but then further, it turns into it makes you cock your head and say, could this be a plan? I mean, think about it. What did as the time of this recording, what did Biden recently do? But say that employers with 100 or more employees using a loophole through OSHA have to have their employees vaccinated. And let's think about this. What happened for the last 2 years? We destroyed all the businesses that were small businesses, that had under 100 employees. So if I were, an evil emperor, and I'd look and say, well, first, let's destroy all those businesses that have a small amount of employees, because they're the freest people of all. You go to Frank's Pizza on Main Street with 5 employees and say, hey, get your employees vaccinated. Frank's going to give them the Italian salute, right? But then you go to now Frank's wiped out, to your point, and so are many others like that. And what's left are bigger employers, that weathered that storm because they weren't forced to shut down with local businesses. They had a different thing. So now we can go and say, we'll make sure they all get vaccinated. We're going to enforce a vaccination on them. So it gets to be sort of criminal. I mean, I know several of these businesses that have been destroyed, and incidentally, most of whom were immigrants who were working 7 days a week in those businesses, with their families trying to give their kids a better life, etc., forced to shut down, forced out of business, their life savings destroyed, which they had very little to start with. That's what they put into the business. They were willing to do the work. And, and that's what happened, as far as that getting wiped out, which creates more now dependencies on the government, for entitlements, et cetera. And then you get the big businesses coming in and they're going to say, we're going to enforce this vaccine. So, it's a pretty, distressing picture that gets painted. And I think, I would like to see it. I'm sure you probably feature some of them on your podcast and your newsletter, these small businesses, to give them a voice and say, here's what happened to me. I'm the collateral damage. And what did I get for it? I have friends now that run big events. Where are they doing them? In Florida. They would normally do several of these in California and some other states, and they now just run them all in Florida because Florida's fine with it, where these other states won't let them do it. So anyway.
I bet Denmark is going to have a tremendous flood of tourists, which is great. I was planning to get married in New York, and this is not going to work out because I am not subjecting my guests to. How tacky is that? You to get in my wedding, you got to show your vaccination. That's not happening. So I just bolted on out of there, and it's sad to me because, leaving the politics aside, I went to graduate school in New York. I have a lot of very fond memories there, and it's meaningful to me. And so to be displaced from there is I mean, it's not like what people are enduring in Australia, but it's a small thing. But so we're gonna take the big chunk of money we plan to spend and spend it down in Florida and reward those people. So, you can vote with your feet, and that's certainly good to see. But you kind of hit on it when you said, what do I have to show for it? What do we all have to show for all these closures? And this is why I was so sick of this. I've looked at all these different charts comparing this state with this state. You just can't see any difference. Even when they're neighboring states, you cannot. And so you can't say, well, that population is so different from this one, we can't draw any conclusion. When the state is right next to the other state, these people are identical, and you can't tell the difference. So I created a website where you could take a little quiz. And you look at the chart. So, for example, I have a chart of after February 2021, Iowa dropped all its COVID restrictions, and the other Midwest states didn't. They did it they did things like that much later. So, for the next 2 months, you gather data about deaths and whatever, and you graph it. And so, in the quiz, one of the questions is, I haven't labeled any of these states. I've just drawn the lines. Iowa ought to stick out like a sore thumb, right? It ought to be going way. Go ahead, try and pick Iowa out. Go ahead. Which one do you think? So? And of course, you can't tell because they're all identical. You cannot tell. So I decided that people need to see that if they take a quiz like this, they're going to get an F every time. All the know-it-alls who are telling you on Facebook how urgent it is for you to live like a vegetable, they would all get an F. And I don't know about you, Patrick, but when I was in school, on the rare occasion that I got an F on something, oh my gosh, did it grab me like this? Right? So I'm hoping to reproduce that old feeling in the gut in these people. So I put it's at, I don't sell anything on this. It's just, I had to put it up there. Please. It's COVID charts with an S, covidchartsquiz.com. And just try your hand at it. See, and then after a while, you realize the pattern. Well, wait a minute. Sometimes the state that's doing better is the state that did nothing. It should be overwhelmingly obvious if these kind of unprecedented sacrifices were required of everyone. It shouldn't be like a 3% difference. Whatever. It should be overwhelmingly clear which places did what, and it just isn't.
First of all, I'm going to go there and take the quiz today. so covidchartsquiz.com with an S, charts with a plural. Okay, I can't wait to go see what's in there because I've been trying to follow these charts, as much as can be followed, based on what you're saying. Is there a difference? I'd like to know, and we're finding there's not, and especially some people say if there's there's a little bit of a spike of cases. But what happens and how does it trail off after? I mean, we need some time, over time too. I think it will tell a story. But in the end, I can say that there's not compelling data that I've seen anywhere, and it doesn't mean I've seen everything, but I haven't seen any compelling data to say that the COVID restrictions and the shutdowns, et cetera, made any kind of a substantive difference compared to places that didn't do those things. I haven't found it, and I'd like to see it if it exists, but I haven't found it. Any final thoughts or words that you have around all this? I mean, you're somebody who studied history, with an Ivy League education. You're well informed. You're tracking it all. At your fifth decade of life, you're entering it. What do you think about what's going on, and what final words might you have?
Well, it seems like over time, regimes like to demonize people, and they like to pit their populations against each other. And by coincidence, when people are pit against each other, they're not pit against the regime itself.
Mm-hmm.
That's just the way regimes like it. So it can be on all kinds of grounds that certain types of people are demonized. But this is what we're seeing in a lot of regimes around the world, is but I think particularly in the United States, the demonization of dissidents.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't see how that ends particularly well. But the dissidents have turned out to have enough clout somehow that they've been able to hold off some of the worst of it. So at least, as of, let's say, late summer, early fall, the UK, which was all ready to trot out vaccine passports throughout the country with venues and stuff, has walked that back. Even though almost no really influential people were against it. It was just regular people.
Mm-hmm.
So the despised, the discarded, the demonized, it's, they have a little bit of power after all. They can actually make their voices heard after all. That's not just romantic fantasy. They can. And they are the key to getting us out of this. Them not falling into despair and giving up. We can still pull this out because we don't have a majority, but we've got a lot of really, really engaged people.
Yeah.
So I don't want to say that the voice of the people always triumphs. I will say it will never triumph if we all give up because we're demoralized. It's easy to be demoralized. It's much tougher to just stay the course. And a lot of times things that are worth doing tend to be difficult. And this thing is worth doing.
I agree with you. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts around all this, and for your continued efforts to try to bring to light certain aspects of this scenario that people should be aware of. I think looking at charts, looking at data, and actually getting a sense of maybe something closer to truth is a great idea, and it seems like you're ambitious to continue to put that out. So I certainly appreciate you taking the time here and for the work you're doing.
Thank you, Patrick, and thank you for doing this series.
That completes my interview with Thomas Woods. I hope you enjoyed it. Again, understanding history and looking at what's going on today, you can draw some conclusions that might be meaningful. He's a heck of a thinker, and I'm glad that he shared his time with us.